Is it here?
Say congratulations, Mom.
Congratulations.
Go give Mama a big hug.
Look how cool. Face me. No, hold it like this. I got my diploma and I'm opening it.
Congratulations, you've earned this.
What did Daddy get in the mail? Look at the pluses. What do you think?
It looks so good, Mom.
Looks good?
Mm-hmm.
Congratulations!
It is my great pleasure to welcome all of the families, the friends, the administrators, the incredible faculty, and most of all, you, our graduates. Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are excited to celebrate with you today.
We will come out of this stronger than when we went in. We've learned so much. We've grown so much. We're still, at the end, focused primarily on students, and everything else is secondary.
Hi, I'm Sean.
And I'm Joanne.
And we're SNHU graduates. I chose SNHU to get a bachelor's and a master's.
I chose SNHU so I could continue my athletic career.
I just received my degree from SNHU.
SNHU was really supportive of my disability and allowed me to stay engaged in my classes while still attending doctor's appointments.
I am Michelle Barnhart, and I'm a SNU graduate. As a student, SNHU made me feel like I belonged because they were always there for me whenever I needed them.
Everyone's path is different, but the destination and the dream are the same. To hold that degree and say to the world, I'm a college graduate. I did it.
At Southern New Hampshire University, you aren't just a student. You're the author of your own story. You don't just dream, you do. Where others see challenges, you see opportunities. You persevere in spite of everything life throws at you. When things get hard, you dig deep and find a way to push through. And after tackling late nights and rallying for early mornings, your hard work has finally paid off. And today, we are proud to call you graduates.
Hello, my name is Dr. Jennifer Batchelor, and I'm pleased to welcome you to the first ever Southern New Hampshire University virtual commencement. We are thrilled to be celebrating our graduates with their families, friends, as well as our faculty and staff who are watching from all over the world today. We are so proud of all you've accomplished and are very much looking forward to the opportunity to recognize your academic achievements in person as soon as we can. I would like to now ask everyone, if you are able, to please rise for the singing of our national anthem, sung by Jessica Caldwell, a Director of Academic Advising here at SNHU.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Thank you, Jessica. Welcome everyone to this year's commencement ceremonies. We're broadcasting this ceremony live, though many of you may be watching it later, depending on where you are. We have students from around the globe. Time zones may dictate that you watch this with your family at another time. And you might be sitting wherever you are, thinking, well, this isn't the commencement ceremony we planned on. We've thought that more than once. And you wouldn't be wrong. But I want to recall a conversation I had with Laurie Santos from earlier this year. Laurie is an amazing faculty member at Yale, and we had a conversation. You'll hear from her later today as our commencement speaker. And we had a conversation earlier this year in which I was asking her about the impact of the pandemic on our students and the toll it was taking. And she said, yeah, it's been tough, but these students may be the most close-knit class that we'll ever produce. That years from now, decades from now, when they meet each other, they will have this bond. They will be the ones who studied and completed and graduated during a pandemic, something that none of us has ever experienced before, and I hope we won't ever again. And she also reminded me that this is a year in which, despite all the suffering, and it was considerable, life also flourished. People fell in love, people proposed, were married, babies were born. Businesses closed, but a lot of businesses started in the midst of this. And people throughout showed amazing kindness and compassion. And against that backdrop, college degrees were completed as well. You finished. And you did so showing resilience and courage and sacrifice, and many with a burden that was much more than could be expected of you. There are frontline workers in this graduating class. There are public health workers in this graduating class, public safety people, medical professionals. You did all that our society asked of you and more, and you also completed your college degree. We stand in awe. So we celebrate today in this virtual way because that's what public health dictates. And we've made a promise to you that as soon as we can safely do so, we'll have a physical commencement ceremony. And I would love to greet you on stage, see you in the audience. But take pride in this accomplishment. Take more pride in this accomplishment, not less. We will brag about you more in the years to come, not less. We will remember you more vividly, not less. You are an amazing class. And don't let distance and virtual space diminish the virtues of this accomplishment. Commencements are important, really important. They are the parade through the city streets when the team has won the championship. But no one confuses the parade for the game. Parades are not the championships. You won that game in the long hours of being a student and writing papers, completing exams. And when you finished your last class, I know you remember that day, the last assignment was handed in and earned your degree, and in that moment you won the championship. You come into this day the champions of your own story and of our hearts, and we are incredibly proud. Let the ceremonies begin. It's my pleasure to introduce this year's commencement speaker, Dr. Laurie Santos of Yale University. Laurie has received a Doctorate of Humane Letters for her contributions to the social sciences, and more importantly, for her guidance, which has taken on national prominence for how to lead a healthier and happier life. Laurie is an incredibly influential figure who's taught us about resiliency, positive psychology, and in a way that doesn't neglect the genuine challenges and suffering in the world, but instead talks about how we build a meaningful and happy life despite, and in some cases, because of what we've been through. Laurie is perhaps the most apt speaker we could have for this incredible year that we've just been through together. I'm happy to introduce Dr. Laurie Santos.
Hello and good afternoon to everyone watching this 2021 Southern New Hampshire University Commencement Address. To President LeBlanc and all the members of the faculty and staff, to all the honored guests, to the family and friends of everyone at Southern New Hampshire University, and last but definitely not least, to all the graduates here with me today, the Spring 2020, Fall 2020, and Spring 2021 classes. Thank you so much for having me here today. I can't tell you what an honor it is to speak to your commencement class in particular. Simply put, your class is amazing. I'm looking out over this video screen at 45,000 graduates, on-campus and off-campus learners, scholars from all 50 states and more than 50 countries, people from all walks of life who share this love of learning and have come to Southern New Hampshire University to become scholars. I want to take this opportunity to congratulate you for all your accomplishments, big and small, that you've had over the last few years. But I also want to congratulate you on the fact that you've managed to achieve all these accomplishments in one of the most challenging times our country and our world has ever seen. I'm sure that when you signed up to go to college, you didn't think you'd be getting your degree in the middle of a global pandemic. In the last 15 months, all our lives have changed in ways that nobody could have imagined. But in spite of all of those challenges, you're all sitting here today proudly watching this virtual commencement address. You're ready to head off into this new, nearly post-pandemic world with your degree. And that is incredible. You all rock, and you should be really, really proud of yourself. And so when I started thinking about the kinds of things I could say during this virtual commencement address, I wanted to address all the uncertainty and all the difficulty that we've all been facing. But to be totally frank, being a virtual commencement speaker in 2021 is kind of hard, because the usual task of a commencement speaker is to give you some wise and very sure of itself advice, something that you can use for the future. But right now, we're celebrating all of your achievements at a time when the future seems more uncertain than ever. I mean, I am a scientist and a happiness expert, but this is still my first global pandemic. I'm not sure what the next few months or even the next few years hold. And so when I thought what I could tell you during this kind of challenging, strange, uncertain time, I wanted to go back to something that I know will work, something that science tells me is advice that I can be sure of. And so I want to give you a strategy that is known by science to improve not just your physical health, but also your happiness. And that strategy is that I want you to take some time to experience gratitude, the simple act of counting your blessings. Now, feeling grateful right now in such a challenging time can be difficult. It's also a little countercultural. These days, we're more likely to count our hassles than our blessings. But research shows that gratitude can help, especially during difficult times. Grateful people are not only happier, but healthier. They sleep better, and they have stronger immune function. Gratitude can reduce depression and anxiety, and it also can make you more productive. No matter what job you are off to right now, gratitude can make you perform a little bit better. It can also help you with the big things in life, like saving for retirement and eating more healthily. You're less likely to procrastinate if you're feeling grateful, and it's a kind of strategy that can benefit you a lot in the future. And so, in the few minutes I have with you, I wanted to try it. I want you to experience some gratitude. So, bear with me wherever you are. I want you to close your eyes, and I want you to take a minute to just recognize how lucky you are to come to a place like Southern New Hampshire University. Think about how lucky you feel and how grateful you are. But even more than that, I want you to take a moment to experience gratitude for all the people who've helped you along the way. Because the fact is, none of you've made this journey on your own. This big accomplishment that you're all experiencing right now, it is something that you share with a huge village. Now, I think soon all of you are going to get your diplomas, and when it arrives, you're going to open it up and look at your name there, in big bold letters. But I want you to remember all the names that are also there in invisible ink, the many, many, many other names that have helped you with this accomplishment. And I want you to remember that they're not written on there in an obvious way, but they are there in invisible ink. On your diploma in invisible ink is going to be the name of your mothers and fathers, sisters and brothers, aunties and uncles, cousins, family, friends, grandparents, step-parents, everyone who's been there for you. On that name in invisible ink is going to be countless numbers of friends who've been there for you when you needed them, who've given you advice, who've talked you through the tough times. On there in invisible ink are probably your high school teachers, mentors, coaches, everyone who's been by your side through the long history of learning that you've had. And on that diploma in invisible ink are also going to be generations of people before you who've worked incredibly hard so that one day you could call yourself a college graduate. Now I want you to take a moment to notice how you feel, thinking about how lucky you are, all those names of people who've helped you along the way. That warmth in your chest, maybe some of those almost happy tears you might be shedding right now, that is a genuine feeling of gratitude and connection. It's a feeling that this world has your back. And that's what gratitude can do. It's a performance-enhancing drug, and one that's likely to give you lots more happy feelings in the time to come. Class of 2021, I hope you will take this scientific tip to heart. I speak for everyone else who's watching this when I say that so many of your teachers and family members and friends are incredibly proud of you and incredibly grateful that you've now graduated. Congratulations on all your accomplishments. And here's to deeply and intentionally appreciating all that life brings you from here all out. Congratulations, and thank you for having me as your virtual commencement speaker.
President LeBlanc, I am pleased to introduce the newest graduates of Southern New Hampshire University's health profession programs. Our health profession graduates will enter the healthcare industry prepared with academic degrees, expertise, and experience in an impressive array of disciplines and specializations, including healthcare administration, health information management, community health, health sciences, and public health. These graduates are prepared to promote a culture of health within a diverse society ready to meet the challenges of an ever-evolving healthcare system. Our graduates have acquired the knowledge, skills, professional dispositions, and competencies they need to succeed in their careers. These graduates will enter a more complex, dynamic, interconnected, and demanding environment than the graduates before them. Through their studies at SNHU and their real-world experiences, they are prepared to succeed in the highly challenging environments that await them. These graduates transition from being yesterday's students to being today's professionals and tomorrow's leaders in the healthcare field. Additionally, please allow me to thank the many faculty, associate deans, advisors, and staff who have contributed to the success of these learners. Your work will have lifelong positive impact on the lives of these graduates.
Congratulations to the newest graduates of SNHU's health profession programs.
At every graduation ceremony, there's one last piece that makes it official. And it's a bit of legal language that I'm required to read. I didn't read it one year when I started at SNHU, so there may be a whole class of people who think they graduated, and they may not have, but don't tell them. But you will be taken care of. So here we go. By the authority vested in me by the Board of Trustees of Southern New Hampshire University and by the General Court of the State of New Hampshire, I hereby confer the degrees of Doctor of Education, Doctor of Philosophy, International Master of Business Administration, Master of Business Administration, Master of Education, and Master of Science. The Bachelor of Arts, Bachelor of Applied Science, and Bachelor of Science. Associate in Arts and Associate in Science, with all rights, honors, privileges thereto. Congratulations.
Alyssa Allen, Master of Public Health. Jessica Alvitres, Master of Public Health. Kwadwo Asare Jayabur, Master of Public Health. Abigail Blake, Master of Public Health. Tristan Brown, Master of Public Health. Dennis Clark, Master of Public Health. Lindsay Coleman, Master of Public Health. Erica Dahl, Master of Public Health. Jessie Day, Master of Public Health. Bridget Diggins, Master of Public Health. Molly Hancharuk, Master of Public Health. Jamishia Herndon, Master of Public Health. Nicholas Jennings, Master of Public Health. Carmel Joseph, Master of Public Health. Hakop Kevlian, Master of Public Health. Caitlin Loomis, Master of Public Health. Oscar Martinez, Master of Public Health. Marika Matthew, Master of Public Health. Imelda Dole, Master of Public Health. Jason Noble, Master of Public Health. Blessing Orisa, Master of Public Health. Brittany Perry, Master of Public Health. Kemar Reed, Master of Public Health. Jillian Richard, Master of Public Health. Crystal Robertson, Master of Public Health. Valia Samarco, Master of Public Health. Rachel Schaefer, Master of Public Health. Soresh Sharif, Master of Public Health. Alexa Stanley, Master of Public Health. Angela Tourtelot, Master of Public Health. Heather Tucker, Master of Public Health. Lamar Watson, Master of Public Health. Selamawit Wundamo, Master of Public Health. Faiza Brar, Master of Science. Laura Adams, Master of Science. Tyria Adams, Master of Science. Jezen Adley, Master of Science. Jill Alessi, Master of Science. Jennifer Ampafo, Master of Science. Elizabeth Anderson, Master of Science. Jody Anderson, Master of Science. Ugochi Andizi, Master of Science. Elaine and Arciaga, Master of Science. Zaina Omisala Ari, Master of Science. Andrea Atkins, Master of Science. Rashad Austin, Master of Science. Teresa Austin, Master of Science. David Avetian, Master of Science. Ramiro Ayala, Master of Science. Rebecca Bachman, Master of Science. Brian Bailey, Master of Science. Zenisha Bain, Master of Science. Rafina Baksh, Master of Science. Meminata Bangura, Master of Science. Allison Barbara, Master of Science. Austin Barnes, Master of Science. Imani Barnes, Master of Science. Brittany Barron, Master of Science. Tracy Barrett, Master of Science. Charlotte Batiki, Master of Science. Leah Bates, Master of Science. Renee Beeman, Master of Science. Aaron Bean, Master of Science. Blake Bedke, Master of Science. Quavian Belton, Master of Science. Jason Ballou, Master of Science. Ashley Benjamin, Master of Science. Adrian Berney, Master of Science. Alexandra Bertolini, Master of Science. Joseph Beschel, Master of Science. Chris Bisson, Master of Science. Modalani Bolarinwa, Master of Science. Brianna Bonner, Master of Science. Edward Bonner, Master of Science. Fanny Booker, Master of Science. Brittany Botello, Master of Science. Chelsea Bourne, Master of Science. Jacqueline Bork, Master of Science. Kimberly Bowden, Master of Science. Sarah Bowers, Master of Science. Eric Bracco, Master of Science. Jason Branton, Master of Science. Elizabeth Breha, Master of Science. Donna Brewer, Master of Science. Danielle Brindisi, Master of Science. Brianna Brinkley, Master of Science. Jacob Brossett, Master of Science. Brittany Brown, Master of Science. Adina Buba, Master of Science. Brianna Buckley, Master of Science. Linda Bajinski, Master of Science. Laura Buellman, Master of Science. Tam Lynn Burho, Master of Science. Latina Burns, Master of Science. Melissa Burns, Master of Science. Christine Cato, Master of Science. Sandra Calvert, Master of Science. Renee Cano, Master of Science. Jamie Carney, Master of Science. Catherine Carr, Master of Science. Hannah Carrier, Master of Science. Darlene Cotelo, Master of Science. Laura Sarah, Master of Science. Tiara Cheatham, Master of Science. Jonathan Philip Chu, Master of Science. Jennifer Klebeck, Master of Science. Kimberly Cohn, Master of Science. James Collado, Master of Science. Christina Collins, Master of Science. Stephen Collins, Master of Science. Robin Connolly, Master of Science. Christine Cook, Master of Science. Evaniqua Cooper, Master of Science. Elise Corbeil, Master of Science. Jessica Cortez, Master of Science. Jody Costello, Master of Science. Kayla Crawford, Master of Science. Matthew Danes, Master of Science. Maureen Daly, Master of Science. Shantae Daniel, Master of Science. Jory Davis, Master of Science. Ling Davis, Master of Science. Yelena Davidoff, Master of Science. Shannon Dawkins, Master of Science. Courtney Day, Master of Science. Sarah D'Angelo, Master of Science. Brittany Dearmont, Master of Science. Nicole Debus, Master of Science. Janice DeFreitas, Master of Science. Shannon Delaney, Master of Science. Melissa DeVilma, Master of Science. Sean Devlin, Master of Science. Natasha Diaz, Master of Science. Tara DiDonato, Master of Science. Kaylee Dido, Master of Science. Amanda Deere, Master of Science. Christopher Dinanzio, Master of Science. Chris Dirth, Master of Science. Monica Dixon, Master of Science. Amy Doran, Master of Science. Brenda Duggar, Master of Science. Maria Duncan, Master of Science. Elizabeth Duty, Master of Science. Robert Eason Muhammad, Master of Science. Allison Eck, Master of Science. Elizabeth Edgerton, Master of Science. Curleen Edme Valdez, Master of Science. Mackenzie Earhart, Master of Science. Nabiha El-Jachi Glenn, Master of Science. Brianna Elder, Master of Science. Saucida Ellis, Master of Science. Loretta Ellsworth, Master of Science. Sarah Endres, Master of Science. Constance Fant, Master of Science. Dawn Farinetta, Master of Science. Christine Farland, Master of Science. Caitlin Ferroni, Master of Science. Juliana Ferdinand, Master of Science. Erica Fermin, Master of Science. Elaine Ferreira, Master of Science. Tara Ferriola, Master of Science. Kylie Fisher, Master of Science. Victoria Floyd, Master of Science. Jody Forschmidt, Master of Science. Samantha Falk, Master of Science. Danielle Fox, Master of Science. Isis Raymonda Fox, Master of Science. Nicole Fraley, Master of Science. Tanza Francois, Master of Science. Emile Frankenberger, Master of Science. Hannah Franklin, Master of Science. Mira Gaba, Master of Science. Adriana Genzel, Master of Science. Paul Gala, Master of Science. Christine Gallagher, Master of Science. Oliver Garcia, Master of Science. Vincent Garcia, Master of Science. Anya Gavrilovic, Master of Science. Otunimiat George Will, Master of Science. Elijah Godin, Master of Science. Caitlin Gray, Master of Science. Megan Gray, Master of Science. Sarah Greathead, Master of Science. Myosha Green, Master of Science. Portia Green, Master of Science. Lauren Green, Master of Science. Keelandra Greer, Master of Science. Whitney Griesbach, Master of Science. Brittany Anais Guerra Rangel, Master of Science. Dialyn Guillaume, Master of Science. God's Favor Guillet, Master of Science. Sarah Hadley, Master of Science. Jasmine Hairston, Master of Science. Madeline Hansen, Master of Science. James Harden, Master of Science. Ferrari Harper, Master of Science. Angela Harrell, Master of Science. Acacia Harrison, Master of Science. Sarah Jane Harsith, Master of Science. Laura Harwood, Master of Science. Sana Hashmi, Master of Science. Casita Henry, Master of Science. Juliet Henry Ebanks, Master of Science. Anna Hernandez, Master of Science. Jordan Hicklin, Master of Science. Courtney Hicks, Master of Science. Tidy Higgins, Master of Science. Aaron Hightower, Master of Science. Tamara Hillstrom, Master of Science. Dakota Hilton, Master of Science. Bradley Hinesley, Master of Science. Annie Hobrock, Master of Science. Jessica Hockman, Master of Science. Haley Hodges, Master of Science. Elizabeth Hoey, Master of Science. Jacqueline Hoey, Master of Science. Kathleen Holdsworth, Master of Science. Paula Holligan, Master of Science. Kyla Hughley, Master of Science. Joanne Hussey, Master of Science. Charlotte Hutchison, Master of Science. Chidi Ibiawuchiobialo, Master of Science. Odamisa Egbuya, Master of Science. Alexander Ida, Master of Science. Sandrine Iazire, Master of Science. Givany Jackson, Master of Science. Rejoice Jacob, Master of Science. Dominique Jamie Canberra, Master of Science. Courtney Jenkins, Master of Science. Corey Jester, Master of Science. Corey Johnson, Master of Science. Edlyn Johnson, Master of Science. Emily Johnson, Master of Science. Shanice Johnson, Master of Science. Aaron Jossett, Master of Science. Hemanthini Kalyuboalijdona, Master of Science. Patricia Kamara, Master of Science. Hannah Katz, Master of Science. Dusty Kennedy, Master of Science. Melissa Kahn, Master of Science. Shahira Khan, Master of Science. Nadine Korikisada, Master of Science. Naomi Kiangonio, Master of Science. Elizabeth Kabunjamiliai, Master of Science. Aaron Killian, Master of Science. Alyssa King, Master of Science. Sharice Kinlodge, Master of Science. Patrick Kirby, Master of Science. Patricia Kirk, Master of Science. Melissa Knox, Master of Science. Tiffany Knox, Master of Science. Amy Kohler, Master of Science. David Colta, Master of Science. Carrie Krzan, Master of Science. Carl Krogman, Master of Science. Tenzin Kunkiap, Master of Science. Malgorzata Kwapong, Master of Science. Stephanie Lalan, Master of Science. Mead Love Lambert, Master of Science. Jamie Lang, Master of Science. April Lawson, Master of Science. Gabriella Lazarowitz, Master of Science. Lauren Legere, Master of Science. Aaron Laguerre, Master of Science. Ashley LeMay, Master of Science. Brianna Lembo, Master of Science. Chelsea Lewis, Master of Science. Vivian Lewis McKenney, Master of Science. Kelsey Liakos, Master of Science. Janine Ligori, Master of Science. Oscar Linares, Master of Science. Tiffany Little, Master of Science. Han Leo, Master of Science. Chinzia Lobuono, Master of Science. Stephanie London, Master of Science. Eric Lonskak, Master of Science. Christina Laredo, Master of Science. Denise Loya, Master of Science. Melissa Lugo, Master of Science. Bongyu Mabhina, Master of Science. Taylor Mace, Master of Science. Yanqing Mai, Master of Science. Dawn Malavenda, Master of Science. Taylor Mallet, Master of Science. James Malley, Master of Science. Christine Maloney, Master of Science. Callie Maltese, Master of Science. Hannah Manji, Master of Science. Michelle Mann, Master of Science. Carly Morena, Master of Science. Alejandro Margarito, Master of Science. Jason Marlowe, Master of Science. Marissa Mayfield, Master of Science. Joshua Maynor, Master of Science. Dina Mayo Jones, Master of Science. Mara Macaulay, Master of Science. Jamaica McCrae, Master of Science. Laura McGee, Master of Science. Sarah McGee, Master of Science. Amy McGinnis, Master of Science. Katie McGuire, Master of Science. Holly McKee, Master of Science. Leonetria McLinn, Master of Science. Dorothy McRoberts, Master of Science. Reginald Meadows, Master of Science. Lauren Medford, Master of Science. Christina Minio, Master of Science. Kelly Menke, Master of Science. Nikki Mioli, Master of Science. Dustin Miconi, Master of Science. Brett Miller, Master of Science. Melissa Milliken, Master of Science. Brooke Mitchell, Master of Science. Karen Mizukami, Master of Science. Adrian Mogul Sebastian, Master of Science. Jessica Moody, Master of Science. Karen Moon, Master of Science. Ashley Moore, Master of Science. Jennifer Morales, Master of Science. Michelle Morales, Master of Science. Stephanie Morales Romero, Master of Science. Ernest Morris, Master of Science. Sadie Mounts, Master of Science. Ashley Mora, Master of Science. Augustine Muhizi, Master of Science. Amy Murphy, Master of Science. Rachel Murphy, Master of Science. Wanjiro Muya, Master of Science. Akane Nakamura, Master of Science. Crystal Nakamura, Master of Science. Carolyn Nemsek, Master of Science. Edwin Nipe, Master of Science. Yusuf Nesseri, Master of Science. Lori Nunez, Master of Science. Natalie Nyambura, Master of Science. Daniel O'Connell, Master of Science. Sally O'Connor, Master of Science. Adebola Ogundahin, Master of Science. Abigail Olagunju, Master of Science. Estefania Olivas, Master of Science. Christina Oliveri, Master of Science. Arnold Opoku, Master of Science. Amy Oriaki, Master of Science. Margarita Ortiz, Master of Science. Victor Ortiz, Master of Science. Ayobami Oyediji, Master of Science. Tina Pabon, Master of Science. Elizabeth Pabon Vasquez, Master of Science. Andrew Pais, Master of Science. Alexandra Panagor, Master of Science. Denise Parker, Master of Science. Patricia Parker, Master of Science. Isha Patel, Master of Science. Allison Paul, Master of Science. Jean-Marie Paul, Master of Science. Cheryl Pearson, Master of Science. Renee Petku, Master of Science. Cassandra Peden, Master of Science. Susan Pedro, Master of Science. Tamsin Pelaez, Master of Science. Ekaterina Pelapolina, Master of Science. Tammy Pellegrino, Master of Science. Jennifer Pelletier, Master of Science. Crystal Phillips, Master of Science. Natalie Phillips, Master of Science. Sadari Phillips, Master of Science. Joel Pike, Master of Science. Tracy Pinkston, Master of Science. Mikisha Plesko, Master of Science. Amber Pope, Master of Science. Emmanuel Ponce Gonzalez, Master of Science. Nicole Presti, Master of Science. Ashley Price, Master of Science. Teresa Proctor, Master of Science. Whitney Pruitt, Master of Science. Dominique Pryor, Master of Science. Marlene Puckerine, Master of Science. Lonelle Purvis, Master of Science. Hillary Quick, Master of Science. Luis Ramirez, Master of Science. Callison Randolph, Master of Science. Joyce Raposo, Master of Science. Larika Rayford, Master of Science. Jansen Reeder, Master of Science. Scott Rebo, Master of Science. Matthew Rem, Master of Science. Allison Rend, Master of Science. Yvette Rengifo, Master of Science. Abigail Rennick-Wagner, Master of Science. Joanne Reyes, Master of Science. Heidi Reifenberg, Master of Science. Asia Robinson, Master of Science. Rocio Rodriguez, Master of Science. Samantha Romano, Master of Science. Vanessa Rosario, Master of Science. Brian Ruan, Master of Science. Alexa Rudolph, Master of Science. Evan Rohara, Master of Science. Anita Liz Ruiz, Master of Science. Kaylin Rushford, Master of Science. Nikita Santiago, Master of Science. Hea Sarsour, Master of Science. Jonathan Scott, Master of Science. Lanisha Scott, Master of Science. Michelle Scott, Master of Science. Amanda Sebastian, Master of Science. Lindsay Seeley, Master of Science. Carrie Shaw, Master of Science. Robert Sherman, Master of Science. Matthew Sharrow, Master of Science. Brittany Schutz, Master of Science. Heather Silva, Master of Science. Britton Simoneau, Master of Science. Kevin Sinai, Master of Science. Contagia Small, Master of Science. Aljifa Smith, Master of Science. Alyssa Smith, Master of Science. Alyssa Smith, Master of Science. Hannah Smith, Master of Science. James Smith, Master of Science. Janae Smith, Master of Science. Vaughn Giona Smith, Master of Science. Kaylin Saltis, Master of Science. Kelly Ann Soto, Master of Science. Vanessa Sowell, Master of Science. Jennifer Sperano, Master of Science. Kathy Stavropoulos, Master of Science. Timothy Stewart, Master of Science. Bethany Sullivan, Master of Science. Jennifer Sundquist, Master of Science. Dawn Sweet, Master of Science. Daniel Swierch, Master of Science. Ashia Sylvester, Master of Science. Claudia Tassi, Master of Science. Kate Tada, Master of Science. Riley Tatum, Master of Science. Alphonse Taveras, Master of Science. Regine Tancuano, Master of Science. Ashley Thompson, Master of Science. Amber Thorne, Master of Science. Catherine Titus, Master of Science. Francis Torres, Master of Science. Juliet Torres, Master of Science. Jessie Trottier, Master of Science. Olga Tysh, Master of Science. Melissa Olsena, Master of Science. Annalise Unruh, Master of Science. Taylor Vallele, Master of Science. William Velasquez, Master of Science. Erica Vidal, Master of Science. Annan Glack Bonkerchif, Master of Science. Ashley Waddell, Master of Science. Doreen Walcott, Master of Science. Ariadne Walker, Master of Science. Alicia Ware, Master of Science. Maureen Watchmaker, Master of Science. Robert Waters, Master of Science. Leah Waybright, Master of Science. Sarah Welsh, Master of Science. Laura Whalen, Master of Science. Melissa Whitby, Master of Science. Dominique White, Master of Science. Clarissa Whiteley, Master of Science. Misha Whitaker, Master of Science. Susan Whittier, Master of Science. Lonnie Wilkerson, Master of Science. Hina Williams, Master of Science. Rebecca Williams, Master of Science. Bonnie Wilson, Master of Science. Francis Ray, Master of Science. David Yannetti, Master of Science. Shanaeaz Yassim, Master of Science. Stacy Zano, Master of Science. Ashley Anzioli, Master of Science. Jeffrey Zarang, Master of Science. Molly Clybourne, Master of Science in Management. Darlene Gilliard, Master of Science in Management. Stephanie Gonterman, Master of Science in Management. Kelly Oldag, Master of Science in Management. Devone Ratana, Master of Science in Management. Connor Shortle, Master of Science in Management. Janice Wright Brown, Master of Science in Management.
Congratulations to the newest graduates of Southern New Hampshire University. On behalf of the Alumni Board of Directors, I am honored to officially welcome you into the SNHU Alumni Association. Today, more than 156,000 SNHU alumni around the world congratulate you on your success and hope you will be an active part of our global SNHU community. At this time, if you are one of our learners who has earned an associate's or bachelor's degree, I invite you to participate in the ceremonial tradition of moving your tassel from the right side of your cap to the left. As you go forth today, always remember the university's motto, Summa Optimaque, in English, the greatest and the best. And indeed, you are. Congratulations again.